They say you only notice fate when it's already behind you, when the door has closed and you are standing barefoot in its dust, wondering when it left and why you didn't hear it go. But I think fate always whispered to me from the plum tree. I was born in the spring, during the first bloom of the orchard that ran along the back fields of our village. My mother told me I came into the world quietly, without tears, eyes wide open like I was already listening for something. The boy next door came screaming 2 weeks later. His mother said he wailed so loudly the geese flew off the pond and didn't return for 3 days. That was our beginning. Me, silent and still, him, wild and loud. Our houses stood side by side, roofs nearly touching, separated only by a low fence made of bamboo and thyme. In summer, we climbed it. In autumn, we sat on it. In winter, we leaned against it to trade warmth like smuggled fire. His name was Shen Liang. He was all knees and elbows, hair that refused to stay tied, and eyes like a promise, bright, reckless, and full of the future. We were inseparable. From the moment we could walk, our paths tangled. We ran barefoot through flooded rice paddies, shouted secrets into jars, and buried them, tied wish paper to the legs of crickets and let them loose in the hills. He used to say, "One day, I'll leave this village, May. I'll be a scholar. Maybe even a minister. They'll write my name on silk banners and read my poems aloud in the capital." I never doubted it. I'd seen how fast he could memorize the book of songs, how he argued with the schoolteacher with more wit than shame. He had a mind too big for our dirt roads. He also had nothing. His family was poor. His father's leg had been broken in a field accident and never healed right. His mother washed laundry and cooked for wealthier neighbors. They had no dowry, no legacy, and no lanterns on festival days unless someone gave them a spare. My family had slightly more, 2 pigs, a chest of cloth, and 1 silver comb that belonged to my grandmother. But more importantly, they had dreams for me. A good marriage. Stability. Maybe a life with a cloth merchant's son in a larger village. They never said it outright, but everyone understood. Shen Liang was not my future. Except I believed otherwise. We built a little world of our own, he and I. And at the center of that world stood the plum tree in my family's courtyard. Its branches arched over our fence. Every spring, it rained white petals over both houses, and we made it our shrine. We tied strips of red thread to its limbs and made wishes. He once told me at 13, as the blossoms drifted into his hair, "When I pass the exam and return, I'll marry you beneath this tree. You'll wear red. I'll bring a white horse. And everyone in the village will know what I became because of you." I said nothing, but I remember I turned away to hide the way my lips trembled. Because I already knew what I'd do for him. Anything. When we turned 16, his talk of the capital turned from dreams to plans. The local teacher, old Master Huang, said Shen Liang had the mind to pass the prefectural level exam. But he would need money. Lots of it. For ink. For brush. For rice. For travel. For lodging. For the appearance of worth, as Master Huang put it, in a tone soaked with bitter wisdom. His parents couldn't afford even the journey. He didn't ask me. He didn't have to. In the middle of a moonless night, I crawled beneath my parents' bed and pulled out the red lacquered box they had shown me only once. Inside was my dowry, 3 silver bracelets, a stack of folded cloth, a pouch of jade buttons, and 35 taels of silver. The silver was meant for the day I became a wife. My mother had said, "Your price is modest, but clean. Any man with sense will know we raised you right." I took 25 of it. The next day, I gave it to Shen Liang. He stared at the pouch in his hands like it weighed 1,000 jin. "May," he whispered. "Is this? Are you sure?" I nodded. "You said you'd come back and marry me," I said. "So do it." He didn't kiss me. He didn't cry. But he gripped my hand so tightly I still remember the ache in my knuckles, even now, all these years later. The morning he left, I waited by the plum tree. He wore the cleanest robe he owned, patched at the hem, and carried a cloth sack over his shoulder. His mother walked him to the edge of the village, eyes wet but proud. His father leaned on a cane, watching in silence. Shen Liang stopped only once. He turned, looked straight at me, lifted a hand, 2 fingers pressed to his brow, a playful salute. "I'll be back before the next spring," he called, "with red silk and a marriage contract." Then he disappeared into the dust. And I stood beneath the tree, petals in my hair, and let my heart follow him. That was the last time we shared the same sky. For a long time after, I would lie awake wondering if he ever looked back. But dreams don't look behind them. They only go forward, dragging fools like me in their wake. After he left, the days lost their color. The plum blossoms withered and fell. The wind turned warm and impatient, carrying the smell of early rains and hoarse sweat from the trade roads. I woke early, worked hard, smiled when spoken to, but in truth, I waited. All the time. I listened for the sound of the post rider's bell, which sometimes passed the village once a week, sometimes once a month. I checked the roadside tree near the well, where our village elders tied messages for collection. I looked toward the path he vanished down, as if staring would bring his feet back. The days passed. The fields greened. And then, a letter arrived. It came wrapped in waxed cloth, tied with a thread the color of dried blood. I held it in my hands as if it might vanish, then took it to the plum tree, where I sat cross-legged in the shade, heart pounding. His handwriting was still messy, like his hair, but I knew it instantly. May. I reached the capital safely. It is more beautiful than we imagined. The gates are 10 men high. The streets smell of ink and roasted meat. I saw scholars in crimson robes, real officials. And for the first time in my life, I felt I could become one of them. But even among the lanterns, I thought of home. Of the plum tree. Of you. The nights are loud here. I miss the silence of the fields. I miss your voice. I'll write again soon. I'm going to make us proud. Wait for me. Shen Liang. I read it until the sun dipped below the hills. Then I read it again. Then I tucked it inside the collar of my robe, where it stayed for 3 days, against my skin, as if warmth could make it real. The next letter came a month later. This one was shorter. He thanked me again for the money. Told me how expensive the lodging was, how even rice cost twice what it did in the village. He mentioned a fellow scholar who had connections at the exam office. He needed proper inkstone, a new brush, a better robe. He didn't ask for more silver. Not directly. But his words trembled under the weight of hope and hunger. And I was already in motion. My father didn't yell when I asked. He stared at me for a long while, his hands folded on the edge of the table. The candle between us flickered and bent as if it too were holding its breath. My mother's lips pressed into a pale line. I lowered my head. "I love him," I whispered. We gave him 10 more tales. Enough to survive. Enough to continue dreaming. Not enough to make him return. Spring passed. Then summer. Then the harvest festival. Each season I imagined him walking through the village gate again, robes fluttering, scroll case over his shoulder, calling my name like a man who had never stopped loving me. Instead, more letters came, each one thinner than the last. His tone began to change, not cold, not cruel, just distant. Like someone walking down a long road, forgetting the scent of the starting place. In his last letter, he mentioned someone named Ming. He said, "Ming knows the capital better than I ever will. She helps me navigate things." Nothing romantic, of course. Don't worry. I hadn't worried until he told me not to. By winter, the letters stopped. Word came through a traveling monk, then the village mayor. A scholar from our province had died in the capital of sudden fever. The records bore Shen Liang's name. His parents went white. His mother screamed. His father didn't move for a long time. They left the village within 3 days to retrieve his remains. I tried to go with them, but I had fallen ill, the fever or grief, I don't know which. My skin burned. My lips cracked. The plum tree lost all its leaves, and I lay in bed, counting cracks in the ceiling and forgetting how to sleep. They never came back. 3 months passed. No ashes. No body. No word. Just absence. I stopped waiting. Or tried to. I started to walk without purpose. Speak without conviction. Live without color. And in that hollow life, a strange thing began to grow. A quiet rage. Not loud. Not wild. Just steady. Like water grinding down stone. I had given him everything. My love. My marriage silver. My name. My future. All he gave me in return was a grave that never arrived. There is a sound grief makes when it settles in the bones. It's not loud. It's not even sad. It's quiet, like dust falling on an altar long forgotten. Like a breath drawn in but never let go. Like a woman who still sets a bowl for someone who will never sit beside her again. That woman became me. My parents stopped asking questions after a while. Stopped speaking his name. But every time my mother saw me staring out the window, she would sigh the way people sigh when they're trying not to break dishes. I did not scream. I did not tear my robes. I simply stopped blooming. I went about life like a ghost, cooking, cleaning, harvesting soybeans, tying bundles of sticks. But the world was faded, like walking through water too deep to breathe. Sometimes I'd pass the house next door and pause, waiting for the sound of laughter, the shout of a familiar voice, the creak of the gate he used to slam open when running late to class. But the house was silent now, abandoned, overgrown. The shutters had warped. The paint peeled like the bark of an old tree in winter. His parents had never come back. Neither did he. One day, I found the letters again. All of them. Folded neatly and hidden in the box where I kept hairpins and old combs. I sat under the plum tree with them one last time. Read each one slowly, as though the spaces between the words could still speak. They couldn't. His handwriting had become like dried petals, beautiful once, but now only proof of what had died. I burned them. One by one. Fed each letter to the little clay brazier my father used for incense offerings. The fire crackled. The smoke carried his name into the sky. It smelled like ink, dust, and a lie too large to hold. When I burned the last one, I did not cry. The plum tree bloomed that spring. Wildly. Fiercely. As if the world hadn't changed at all. But I had. I plucked one petal and placed it in a silk pouch. I dug a hole beneath the tree. And I buried the pouch with my last letter, the red thread we once tied to the branches. And the silver comb I had kept for my wedding day. That night, I whispered to the wind, "You can have him. I'm done." But fate was not done with me. It never is. It waits, patient as stone, cruel as memory, kind as a knife. It would return. Just not in the way I expected. And so I lived. For 10 more years. Unwed. Unloved. Unwilling. Every time a man's name was offered to me, I smiled and said, "I'm still waiting for someone." No one knew what that meant anymore. Not even me. 10 years later, I left the village. My parents said I needed fresh air. New voices. Baicheng would be better for me, they said. I said yes. Because the truth was, I had nothing left to lose. But fate is clever. It does not chase you. It waits exactly where you think it cannot reach. And when I turned the corner of that market in Baicheng, on the night of the Lantern Festival, and saw him, whole, smiling, carrying 2 children, with a woman who wasn't me, beneath the glow of red silk lanterns, that was when I died. There is a silence that comes after death. Not the silence of burial, but the kind that echoes like sound swallowed whole. I woke inside that silence. And for a moment, I thought I had become the ghost they always said I was. The first thing I noticed was the weight of the air, warm, rich with spring dampness and something sweeter. The scent of earth before planting. The edge of morning dew. The ceiling above me was familiar. Too familiar. It had a crack in the right corner that curved like a bird's wing, one I used to stare at as a child when I couldn't sleep. My fingers trembled. I raised them slowly. They were small, younger, softer, no calluses from scrubbing floors. No wrinkle at the knuckle where I'd once worn a mourning band too tight for too long. I sat up. My bed was the same narrow cot of bamboo and hemp string I'd slept on at 13, and when I turned, I saw the folded quilt my mother sewed from fabric scraps, the one she had finished the winter before I first fled. A voice rang from the kitchen. "Mayor, are you still asleep? Go fetch water before the sun gets too high." I froze. That voice was younger, stronger. "Mother?" I rose to my feet too fast and nearly stumbled. My knees ached not with age, but with memory. When I opened the door, the courtyard burst into view. Bright, golden with sun. The old plum tree standing tall and full, untouched by time. The house next door still painted, still clean. No weeds, no silence, no abandoned shutters. And from behind the fence, I heard the unmistakable sound. "Get back here, you feathered little demon." Then laughter, clear, sharp, and light as a wind chime in summer. Shen Liang. I gripped the wooden frame of the door until my fingers hurt. He was there on the other side of the fence. Younger, leaner, barefoot, chasing a chicken with a rice bowl in one hand and a stick in the other. Alive, unafraid, untouched by betrayal. I didn't speak to him that day. I couldn't. Instead, I stared from the corner of the courtyard until the sky turned violet and the smell of steamed buns drifted from the kitchen. And when I finally dared to whisper alone, under the plum tree, I said, "Why am I here again?" That night, I crept to my parents' room. I knew where the red box would be beneath the bed, wrapped in 3 layers of faded cloth. I dragged it out with shaking hands. It was lighter than I remembered. Inside were the silver bracelets, the jade buttons, the folded cloth, and the 25 taels of silver. Untouched, unspent, waiting, just as it had been the first time. I stared at it for a long time. In the first life, I gave it away without hesitation. This time, I closed the box and pushed it gently back under the bed. I said nothing to my parents. Not yet. The days passed in quiet ripples. Each moment held 1,000 memories. The squeak of the gate, the taste of overboiled tea, the way my father leaned slightly left when he walked. It was like watching a play I had once starred in, but now I sat in the audience, unable to unknow what would happen. I spoke softly. I obeyed quickly. I hid the sharpness behind my teeth like a blade sheathed in silk. Shen Liang noticed me, of course. He always did. A few days after my awakening, he leaned over the fence, grinning like a fox with stolen dumplings. "You've been quiet," he said. "Did you finally grow a secret you're not ready to tell me?" I forced a smile. A gentle one. Maybe I just grew tired of giving them away. He blinked. His grin faltered, just for a moment. Then it returned, and he tossed a pebble at my feet. "Come to the orchard this evening. I've got something to show you." In my old life, I would have gone. This time, I waited until after sunset, then walked in the opposite direction. I knew what would come. The rhythm of it. How he'd grow obsessed with the exams. How he'd start borrowing ink, scrolls, and advice. How he'd confide in me only when it served his confidence. I remembered how his words would sweeten just before asking for more. But now I also remembered what happened after. The other woman. The city life. The children. The look in his eyes when he didn't see me anymore. This time, I would see everything. I followed him, at first, from a distance. To the schoolhouse. To the river. To the shrine of Wenchong Dijuan, where he lit incense for fortune. I watched how he charmed the teacher. How he borrowed from 3 different neighbors and forgot to return 2. I began to listen instead of love. And the more I listened, the more I heard the hunger behind his words. He did not want me. He wanted escape. And I had been the rope he would climb. This time, I would not become a rope. I would become the hand that lets go. I used to think love was made of sacrifice. That if I gave enough, my time, my silence, my silver, my name, He would understand the shape of my heart and give me something back. But now I saw it more clearly. He had never asked for my love. Not really. He had accepted it like a thirsty traveler accepts a cup of water. Gratefully, briefly, but without remembering the hand that offered it. It took 3 weeks before Shen Liang came to me with his idea. We were sitting beneath the plum tree. He had brought rice cakes wrapped in lotus leaves. I hadn't told him I didn't like the sweet ones anymore. I took a bite and waited. He looked down at his hands, fidgeting with the string around his wrist. The prefectural exam is 3 months away, he said. I nodded. I've thought about it a lot, he continued. I have the skill. Even old Master Huang said so. But he let the pause hang there, like a fisherman letting the bait dangle just above the water. I remembered this moment from before. It had started here. The string tugged, the hook set. I swallowed the rice cake slowly. But, I said, I don't have the means, he said, more quietly now. No silver. My father won't take more from the neighbors. My mother's hands are raw from scrubbing strangers' pots. He looked at me then. Not with desperation, but expectation. You're the only person I trust, May. In my first life, I had rushed to the red box that very night. I hadn't even hesitated. I had given him everything because I thought I was giving it to us. But there had never been in us. Only a boy running toward his own dream, and a girl standing in the wind, handing him her future like a coin. So I smiled gently, just as I had the first time. But this time, the warmth in my voice was measured. Let me speak with my parents, I said. We've saved some silver for my dowry. Maybe they'll allow it. His relief was immediate. You're the only one who believes in me. That was a lie. I didn't believe in him. I believed in the truth I was about to learn. I went to my parents that night, just as I had before. But instead of pleading, I made a careful, calculated appeal. I told them I had grown out of silly girlhood love, that this was an investment in the family name, that if Shen Liang succeeded, we would all be elevated. I watched my father's brow crease, my mother's fingers curl into her sleeves. You truly think he's worth this? My father asked. No, I said, truthfully. But the world does. And that's enough. He stared at me, surprised. Then, slowly, he opened the red box. We gave Shen Liang the silver. 25 taels. More than enough to reach the capital, rent a modest room, purchase supplies. He hugged me, held my hands too long. When I return, he said, I'll wear scholar's robes and bring you silk shoes from the city. And red thread, I added, before I could stop myself. He blinked. For what? To tie our names together, I said. Isn't that what you promised? He laughed and nodded. Yes, of course. Red thread. How could I forget? But he had forgotten. He always would. That night, I did not sleep. I sat beneath the plum tree, listening to the wind move through its branches like an old song. I traced the scar in the bark where we had once carved our names. Only now, I could see. My name had always been smaller, always carved below his. He left the village 2 days later. I watched from the window this time. No tears. No prayer. No wishes tied to the tree. Only a notebook in my hands, blank, waiting. Because this time, I was going to write everything down. I would give him everything he needed. Not because I loved him, but because I wanted to see exactly what he did with it. Because when you truly want to break a man, you don't strike from above. You hand him the very rope he will hang himself with. The day after he left, I returned to my old patterns. But this time, everything had changed. I no longer stared down the road, waiting for a letter. I did not whisper to the wind beneath the plum tree. I no longer wrote his name in the steam of my bathwater. Instead, I wrote numbers, costs, distances, connections. I began to study maps, traders' routes, couriers' paths, the timeline of the exam system. I learned how long it took to ride from Yangzhou to the capital, how often the scholars were housed in dormitories, which inns were known to host provincial examinees. I visited the teacher's house with small offerings of pickled plums and soy cakes. He thought I came for kindness. In truth, I came for information. From him, I learned the names of former students who had gone to the capital. Men with families there. Men whose habits could be predicted even 10 years before they bloomed. From the widow in the market square, I bought discarded exam booklets. From the apothecary's second son, I stole gossip. And all the while, I smiled sweetly. I swept floors. I served my mother warm rice with ginger. I laughed when the neighbor's boy spilled chicken feed across our courtyard. But inside, I was sharpening. The girl I had been was dead. The one who waited. The one who begged her parents for silver just to feel closer to a promise. The one who kept his letters pressed to her chest like talismans. She had been buried under the plum tree the day I burned those letters. What rose in her place wasn't born for dreaming. It was born for watching. 2 weeks after Shen Liang left, I told my parents I wanted to visit my cousin in Baicheng. Just for a few weeks, I said. To clear my head. They looked surprised, maybe even pleased. Perhaps they thought I was healing. They didn't know I was hunting. I packed modestly. A worn robe. A comb. A single book of poetry I never opened. But hidden in my sash was the map I'd drawn, marked with courier stations, temple lodging, and the locations of every friend of Shen Liang's father that I could recall. Men who owed favors. Men who had mouths. I traveled lightly, blending in with the women and girls headed to the markets. I wore my hair plain. I smiled politely. No one remembered me 5 minutes after I passed. Which was exactly what I wanted. In Baicheng, I didn't stay with my cousin. I found a widow who rented out her back room for 2 jiao a week. I helped her with her errands and never asked questions. She liked me. That was enough. And from that base, I waited, listened, watched. 2 weeks later, I saw him again. Not face to face, but across a courtyard behind a tea house. He didn't see me, why would he? He was laughing with another young scholar, stuffing dumplings into his mouth like a man with no weight on his shoulders. His robe was new. His shoes polished. The brush tucked into his sash looked fresh from the artisan's workshop. And I knew, without needing proof. He had already spent most of the silver. That night, I wrote my first entry in the notebook. Day 1. He's not suffering. He's thriving. And so began my second life in truth. Not as a lover. Not as a wife-to-be. Not as a ghost. But as a shadow. A witness. A blade kept warm in silk. Love taught me how to wait. Betrayal taught me how to watch. But silence. Silence taught me how to survive. The capital was louder than I remembered. It buzzed like a hive in spring, too many people talking at once, too many wheels clattering on stone, too many lanterns that flickered and lied. Shen Liang once told me that cities were made for men like him, where a clever tongue and a clean robe could pass for greatness. I used to believe him. Now I watched him walk those streets in silk he hadn't earned, laugh beside scholars he'd borrowed silver from, and speak like the world already owed him success. He did not look like a man building a future. He looked like a man performing one. He stayed in a scholar's dormitory on the edge of the East Quarter, funded, in part, by a family I recognized from our province. I learned their son had failed the exam 3 years prior, but still claimed the title, Fusheng. Shen Liang flattered him daily. He took meals at the same noodle shop every 4th evening, paid in full with copper that didn't come from him. He played weiqi with an older scribe in the afternoons badly, but with loud charm. He bought ink from a widow with a limp, never haggled the price, and sometimes left her sweet buns on the sill. That, I admit, softened me. Until the 7th night, when I saw him again with her. She was younger than me. Of course. She wore a yellow sash, bright, unearned, untouched by work. Her hair was perfectly braided, a red pin perched like a phoenix between the strands. She walked like she believed she belonged beside him. And he held her wrist as they walked. Not her hand, her wrist, gently, like he was guiding her. Or claiming her. She laughed at something he said and leaned into his shoulder like water curving into a rock. He smiled. The same smile he once gave me when we hid behind the plum tree and he told me he'd return with silk. I went home that night and didn't cry. I lit a single candle, opened my notebook, and wrote. Letter 1. You've spent my silver on her smile. You don't know it yet, but I am still watching. I wonder if your hands remember mine when they brush her hair aside. I wonder if you dream of the plum tree, or if that too is burned. I won't stop you. Not yet. But when the time comes, I will be the ink that ruins your name. M. I wrote one letter every 3 days after that. Not to him. Not for him. For me. To mark what I saw. To write the truth no one else seemed willing to. Week by week, I peeled back the curtain of his life. I learned he owed coin to the rice merchant 2 alleys down. That he'd borrowed a second robe from the laundry wife on a promise of repayment. That he wrote the same poem for 2 different girls, only changing the names. I watched him smile through failures, charm his way past debts, lie with such ease that even I sometimes believed him until I remembered the grave I once stood beside, thinking him dead. The letters I once clutched to my chest, I now burned in my mind, rewriting every one of them as it should have been. Not, I miss you, but I am spending you. Not, I love you, but I need what you can give me. Not, I'll return to you, but I'll return when it's easy. One afternoon, he visited a silk shop. I thought it was to prepare for the exam. Instead, he asked about wedding cloth. The shopkeeper didn't know I stood behind the paper screen, holding a bolt of blue gauze in my hands like it might strangle me. Shen Liang smiled and asked about red bridal silk. He said the girl's name, Mingyu. Said he would propose after the spring exam. Said the silver she gave him was from her father's trade in tea bricks. I stood in that silence for a long time. Too long, even after he left. I didn't follow him that night. I didn't write. I didn't breathe. I returned home, sat cross-legged in the dark, and whispered the words I once never dared to say aloud. He never loved me. Not once. He loved what I gave. Not who I was. The next morning, I wrote a letter without ink. I carved the words into memory. To the Ministry of Rights, I wrote. From a citizen of Yangzhou with knowledge of deceit. I hadn't sent it. Not yet. But the ink would come. And so would the reckoning. I began collecting names. Not his. Mine. The girl I had been had no name outside his story. A background character in a future that never included her. But now, I would carve my own name into the spine of his fate. The capital had cracks if you knew where to look. I made friends with a laundress who washed scholar robes at night. She told me which names were whispered with suspicion, which ones were rising stars, which ones were climbing ladders made of borrowed coin and bent backs. Shen Liang's name was not hated. Not yet. But it was not clean either. He owed people more than just coin. He owed faces and favors, and those are harder to repay than silver. I traced Mingyu to her family's estate in the West Quarter. Her father was a tea merchant with political ties in the lower magistrate's office. She was clever, prettier than me in that soft, powdered way that city's reward. She wore red even when not in mourning. She smiled as though the world had always belonged to her. I did not hate her. I pitied her, because I knew how it would end for her too. He would use her name the way he used mine. He would spend her family's wealth the way he spent my dowry. He would promise silk and love and legacy. And then, he would disappear into himself. I didn't go to the Ministry of Rights. Not yet. Instead, I sent a letter, and signed, to Mingyu's father. A warning. Vague, but sharp. Ask him where his inkstone came from. Ask him who paid for his lodging last season. Ask him which village girl bought the brush that wrote you lies. I left no return address. Just truth. Dressed in anonymity. Days passed. Then a week. Then, I saw her on the Scholar Road. Mingyu. Alone. Walking fast. Eyes red. Hands empty. He followed 5 steps behind, face pale, calling her name like a man already buried in regret. She didn't stop. She didn't turn. And he? He stood there in the middle of the street, holding wilted flowers and shaking fingers, like a boy who had just realized no one would clean up after him anymore. I did not smile. Not yet. Justice is not joy. It is silence. The kind that echoes. That night, I wrote a new letter. But this one had a name at the bottom. Mine. To the Ministry of Rights. I write not to harm, but to preserve the sanctity of the exams. There is a candidate registered from Yangzhou province, Shen Liang, whose conduct, debts, and falsehoods are well documented. I have spoken with merchants he has misled, families he has entangled, and scholars he has defrauded. I have kept copies of their names and notes. I ask only that you investigate. If he is innocent, he will rise. If not, he will fall by truth, not by rumor. Mei Lin, daughter of Lin Dao of Yongzhou. I sealed it in wax, pressed it shut, and walked it to the court courier station just before dawn. My hands did not tremble. Not once. The next week was quiet. Too quiet. I didn't follow him. I didn't write. I waited. Because truth moves slowly, but it never misses its mark. Then, one morning, I saw it. The scholar board. Updated. The list of candidates posted publicly at the inner gate of the ministry building. There were new names. New red seals beside them. Symbols of qualified, approved, under review. And there, his name. Shen Liang, under review. By nightfall, he knew. By the next morning, half the scholar dormitory knew. And 2 days later, I watched him sit alone in the tea house he once laughed in, staring into a bowl of cold broth, his brush case clutched to his chest like a dying man's prayer beads. I didn't approach him. I didn't speak. But I sat 2 tables behind, in a corner with steam drifting across my face. And I wrote my final letter. You will not know it was me. But in time, maybe you'll remember the girl beneath the plum tree. Not because you loved her, but because she was the one thread you thought you could pull, without unraveling. There is a kind of justice that makes no sound, no public shaming, no blade, no fire, just a single stroke of ink, through a name that thought it could not be erased. The board was changed overnight. It always was quietly, in the cold hours before sunrise, by clerks whose names no one remembered. Names mattered little to the ministry. Only the strokes. Only the records. That morning, I arrived before the ink dried. I stood in the crowd, no veil, no disguise. Only silence. And when I looked up, I saw the truth I had waited for. Shen Liang, disqualified. No reason listed. No explanation required. Just a red mark. A blank space. A closed door. The crowd whispered. Some were angry. Others laughed. A few muttered about bribes, rumors, political maneuvering. But I knew. This was not scandal. Not revenge. Not slander. It was a simple reckoning. The kind that comes from men who write their futures in other people's blood. I didn't stay long. The city was colder that day, and the clouds hung low over the temple roofs. It smelled like rain and cheap ink. But for the first time since I awoke in the second life, I breathed easily. Not with joy. Not with triumph. But with release. He came to the tea house the next day. The same one where I had first seen him with Mingyu. The same corner. Same chair. But this time, no laughter. Just silence. He sat hunched, elbows on the table, eyes hollow. A man who had climbed a tower only to realize it had no door. When I walked in, I made no attempt to hide. His eyes flicked up and met mine. And there it was. Recognition. Slow. Like ash swirling in water. He stared. And stared. And stared. May? His voice cracked, like a broken instrument too ashamed to speak in tune. Is it really? How long have you been? I didn't answer. I simply sat across from him. The plum blossom pin in my hair caught the light. His mouth opened slightly. He noticed. Of course he did. He reached for my hand. I let him. For a moment. Then I pulled back. Slow. Clean. Final. They took my name off the board, he said. No reason. No appeal. No explanation. He sounded smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I had grown. Did you hear anything? He asked. Back in the village, people still talk. Maybe someone. Why would they? I said. He blinked. I stirred my tea slowly. You're not from there anymore, remember? He looked at me. For the first time, really looked. You haven't changed. No, I said softly. I remembered. His lips trembled. I was going to come back for you, May. Truly. I just needed time. A position. Something worthy. I never meant to. You never meant to lie? To let me grieve you? To let me bury a life around your ghost? His silence was answer enough. He bowed his head. His hands shook. I remembered those hands. How they once brushed my hair aside. How they once held the pouch of silver I had given without a second thought. You were the only one who believed in me, he whispered. I set my cup down. No. I was the only one who remembered what it cost. He looked at me then, not as the girl beneath the plum tree, but as something he had never known how to name. A mirror. A memory. A reckoning. Do you hate me? He asked. I thought for a long time. Then. No. I don't hate you. Then what? I outgrew you. I stood. He didn't. He looked like a man who wanted to fall to his knees, but didn't know if the floor would catch him. Goodbye, Shen Liang, I said. And I meant it. This time. Forever. That night, I walked to the temple at the edge of the city. I lit 3 sticks of incense. One for the girl I used to be. One for the woman I became. And one for the man who had taught me the price of forgetting myself. You think revenge will sing when it's done. That the silence after justice will feel like a hymn. But it doesn't. It feels like a field after harvest. Flat. Still. Cold. Nothing left to cut. Nothing left to grow. Not yet. I returned to the village in early spring. The roads were soft with thaw, the rivers loud with meltwater, and the hills still wore their winter bones. The trees, though bare, looked ready like old women preparing to dance again. I hadn't been back in 2 years. Not since I followed Shen Liang to the capital, not since I buried the girl I used to be. But now I came not as a ghost or a daughter in mourning. I came as a woman who had watched her own name become something sharp, then soft again. My parents had aged. My father's beard had gone white around the edges. My mother's hands trembled when she carried hot bowls. But their eyes still had that weathered steadiness, the kind people in cities never learn to wear. They said nothing at first. They only opened the gate, took my bag, and fed me. We said everything in the way the rice was served. The way my mother added ginger to the soup. The way my father poured tea before speaking. You look different, he said finally. I feel different, I replied. He nodded. Nothing more. That night, I returned to the courtyard. The plum tree still stood. Taller now. Worn. But blooming, early blossoms already scattered along the ground like little ghosts. I sat beneath it in silence, as I once had when I was 13. Only now, I wasn't waiting for anyone to come home. I was the one who had come back. I dug a small hole beneath the tree, not for burial this time. For planting. A peach seed, wrapped in a silk pouch. The last thing I had kept from Baicheng, a gift from the widow who had rented me her back room and fed me soup on cold days. She had given it with a smile and said, "Put it where something once died. Let it live there instead." So I did. I laid the seed in the earth, pressed it down, and whispered, "Grow something better." In the weeks that followed, I found a strange kind of peace. Not happiness, not yet. But room. To breathe. To sleep without dreaming of names written in red ink. To walk past the neighbor's fence and not ache when I remembered Shen Liang hanging upside down from the beam as a child. The house next door had finally been sold. The new owners were quiet people. A young couple with a small child and a goose that refused to stay penned in. They waved when I passed, and the woman offered pickled plum one morning without asking for my name. I accepted it, smiled, ate it slowly beneath the tree. Then one morning, I found the old red box again. My mother had been cleaning. She left it by my door without a word. The lid was faded, the lacquer chipped. But inside, the silver was gone. Of course, but the bracelets remained. The jade buttons, the folded cloth. At the bottom, I found something I hadn't seen in either life. A letter. Folded, yellowed, sealed with wax. It was in my mother's handwriting. Maya. We always knew. Not the whole truth, but enough. That you gave your dowry to that boy. That your heart was tied to him in a way we could never cut, even when we tried. We didn't stop you, not because we agreed, but because we trusted the strength of your choice. You were always brave. If one day you return, not just to this house, but to yourself, take these things back. Not as pieces of your past, but as parts of your new name. Love. Your mother. I folded the letter, laid it over the cloth, closed the box, and for the first time in either of my lives, I cried. Not from grief, not from betrayal, from being seen. Spring moved slowly that year, like a tired child reluctant to wake. The fields thawed, the riverbanks softened, the air shifted, less biting, more fragrant. I rose earlier each day, not because I had to, but because the light itself called me. One morning, as I swept the yard beneath the plum tree, a shadow crossed the wall beside me. I turned. He was tall, not as tall as Shen Liang had been, but broader in the shoulder, slower in movement. He carried a worn carpenter's toolkit, and his sleeves were rolled past the elbow. Apologies, he said, voice low and even. I'm repairing the neighbor's roof. I didn't mean to intrude. His face was sun-darkened, not soft like the capital men I'd once watched brag with scented sleeves. His hands were thick with callus. There was sawdust in his hair. You're not intruding, I said. He nodded and started to turn away. Wait, I said. Do you want water? He paused. I won't say no. We sat on opposite ends of the stone bench under the tree. I poured 2 cups from the clay jar without asking. He drank slowly, gratefully, like someone used to being thirsty. You're not from here, I said. No, he replied. Grew up west. Came here looking for quiet work. Found too much of both. You build homes. Fix them. Build them. Tear them down when they forget how to hold people. He didn't ask me anything. Not where I'd been. Not why I was back. Not why I stared at plum petals as if they owed me something. That was the first thing I liked about him. His name was Lian Jun. He returned the next day to finish the neighbor's roof. Then the next week, to mend a hinge on our barn door. Then again, with no reason, just a small bag of seeds he said he had too many of. We planted them together along the side wall of the courtyard, in silence. It wasn't friendship. Not yet. It was space. Quiet companionship. Not a single thread tied between us. No pressure. No story. Just 2 people who had lived long inside themselves. And now shared a little sun. Over the weeks, we spoke more. Nothing important. How the air smelled different near the old river path. Which teas didn't water down in summer. Where he found the best stone for repairs. He never asked why I avoided town gatherings. I never asked why he never spoke of family. One evening, the wind picked up and scattered the petals early. We stood together, brushing them off the bench. This tree's older than it looks, he said. It remembers too much, I replied. He nodded. He didn't ask what I meant. I buried someone under it, I said. He looked at me. A body. No. A name. He said nothing for a long time. Then, quietly. Names can lie, but roots don't. I think that was the first time I felt something move again in my chest. Not love. Not longing. Just breath. A full one. Like I hadn't taken one in years. Lian didn't offer me anything. Not promises. Not poems. Just time. He came when I asked. stayed quiet when I needed silence, laughed once, softly, when I oversalted the fish and didn't try to hide it. One night, he brought wood scraps to patch the broken beams above the kitchen. We worked by lantern light, our shoulders brushing. My fingers slipped. His hand caught mine. Rough, warm, strong. Not the hands of a dreamer. The hands of someone who held things steady. I didn't pull away. After that, he came in the mornings more often. We didn't speak of what was building, but we let it grow, like the peach sprout beneath the plum tree. One day, he touched the back of my hand and said, "You carry silence like armor." "I wore it too long," I whispered. "Would you let someone hold it for a while?" I said nothing, but I didn't move my hand, and he didn't let go. That night, I wrote a letter. Not to myself. Not to him. Just to the world. I lived twice. Once as someone who gave away everything, believing it would return. Once as someone who took back what was hers and gave nothing in return. This third time, I am simply living. And so, she walked away. From the boy who forgot her. From the life she once gave up. And from the part of herself that still waited beneath the plum tree. This chapter ends not with revenge, but with something deeper. A breath. A space. A beginning. But her story is far from over. Join us next week for Chapter 6. The Death Beneath Lanterns, where we return to the moment her first life ended, and the fire that awakened the woman she is now. Until then, remember, some love stories don't end in marriage. They end in memory.